When it comes to popular Hindi films, and you mention author-backed roles for women, then there are very few options to choose from. It's largely a shortcoming of the format of Hindi films, which does not give women as well-edged characters or author-backed roles, at least not with the same regularity that male counterparts manage to get. You're looking at a film like Mother India or a film like Guide when you think of great women roles, at least roles which are central to the narrative or the plot of the film. Having said that, there are still some actresses who have managed to create a fantastic body of work, largely thanks to a creative collaboration with a filmmaker that has given them great roles, wonderful characters, and some great cinematic moments without too much of a fanfare. One such creative collaboration is the one that was enjoyed by Ramesh Sippy and Hema Malini. Ramesh Sippy started his career as a filmmaker with Andaz, and that was a film which featured Hema Malini, and Hema Malini went on to be a part of the next two films that he made. Of course, their films need no introduction. This was Seeta Aur Geeta and Sholey. But in these three films, what Hema Malini managed to achieve was something that became a kind of a template for many women characters in the films that followed. At Cinemaazi Studios, we are going to look at this creative collaboration with a little more intent and try to find out what made Ramesh Sippy and Hema Malini's collaboration a thing of greatness. By the time Hema Malini and Ramesh Sippy collaborated for the first time in Andaz, which was Ramesh Sippy's debut as a director as well, Hema Malini had already established herself. She was one of the most recognizable faces in the Hindi films. She was poised to become a huge star. And in fact, that tag that she got, the Dream Girl, had already been associated with her. Thanks to her debut in Sapno Ka Saudagar opposite Raj Kapoor. But the bigger hit that Hema Malini enjoyed before she got onto Andaz was Johnny Mera Naam with Dev Anand. One of the biggest hits of the 70s, Johnny Mera Naam firmly established Hema Malini as a star to look out for in the years to come. The son of the legendary film producer G.P. Sippy, Ramesh Sippy was studying in London in the mid-60s when he decided to throw everything up and come back and make films. Now, his father was a very well-established filmmaker, and it would not have been a very difficult thing for Ramesh Sippy to break into the business. But what made it intriguing, what made Ramesh Sippy's debut a little more interesting than the usual debut films, was the kind of subject that he chose. Now, when you're making your first film, you want to play it safe or at least go with a subject that has a ready market, or you're not breaking any barriers there. Ramesh Sippy chose a subject which was very interesting, but he tried to push the envelope as far as the narrative goes by taking a slight risk. Now, he made a film that was essentially a love story between a widow and a widower. The film was Andaz, and it's one of the last few films that Shammi Kapoor had, and it was not a typical Shammi Kapoor film. It had a little bit of glamour, it had a bouquet of lovely songs. A very mellowed love story comparatively, the kind of films that Shammi Kapoor was associated with, because at its core it had a widow and a widower.
बेटी के साथ यहाँ आया हूँ, मुझे की छुपी होगी?
ओह, तो कोई है आपके साथ? मैं सोच रही थी, अकेले अपना ख्याल कैसे रखेंगे?
जी शुक्रिया, मैं अपना ख्याल रख सकता हूँ. Thank you.
Now these are characters that you don't usually associate, or not associated back then, with popular Hindi films or commercial Hindi films. The film gave Hema Malini a lot of opportunity to try and explore a character which her usual gamut of films would not have provided for. You could not expect this kind of histrionics in a film like Naya Zamana, Shararat, Johnny Mera Naam, or the kind of films that a leading top female star of the era would get. Andaz, in hindsight, might largely be recalled because of the excellent cameo that Rajesh Khanna had.
आज अभी शादी कर ले.
पहले पिताजी को तो मना लो.
पिताजी को बाद में मना लेंगे.
तुम्हारे तो सारे काम होते होते हैं. पहले बच्चे होंगे, उसके बाद हनीमून, फिर शादी.
अरे वाह शीतल, मर जाऊं. अभी हनीमून करते हैं, बाद में शादी.
तुम्हारा तो दिमाग खराब.
Or its song.
क्या हो किसने जाना
But upon revisiting the film, you realize that the kind of character that Hema Malini played uh, ends up playing a very, very important role in her filmography. It's not a role that she would usually get to play. And at the beginning of one's career, at least in Hindi films, it was not advisable for actresses to go in for de-glamorized characters or play characters that are usually not that happy and chirpy. So playing a young widow at an early stage in her career was nothing less than a challenge for Hema Malini.
आपके हस्बैंड कहाँ है? बहुत सुबह जल्दी काम पे चले गए वो?
वो अभी इस दुनिया में नहीं है।
There are certain scenes in the film that really stand out, that don't go overboard.
मेरे पति हैं। यही लगता है कि आज भी मेरे साथ हैं। उन्हीं का हौसला लेके दीपू को बड़ा कर रही हूँ।
And that just show what kind of command Hema Malini had over the characters and the frame. You want to look at her, you want to follow her, and she is not doing anything to attract your attention. She is not dressed in some bizarre costumes. She's not, doing some funny antics or gimmickry on the screen, and yet she manages to hold your attention. Now that is what established Hema Malini as a force to reckon with, but it also firmly established Ramesh Sippy as a filmmaker. At that time, in the late 60s, early 70s, the narrative of Hindi cinema was largely the leading man driven. To take an actor who was almost over the hill in Shami Kapoor and to take an iconic superstar, Rajesh Khanna, who was well established as a phenomenon, and give him a small little role. In fact, Rajesh Khanna just has 3 scenes in the film. But to just, make the plot around Hema Malini's character shows that young Ramesh Sippy, he was in his mid-20s when he made Andaz. The kind of command that he had over the language of filmmaking. And this language of filmmaking and this command that Ramesh Sippy had really came in handy with the next film that the two worked on together. Now, the next film that got Hema Malini and Ramesh Sippy together is one of the legendary films in Hindi cinema. Now, on the face of it, Seeta Aur Geeta, where Hema Malini has a double role. You can even see it says Hema Malini and Hema Malini to clearly establish that there should be no doubt. Now, it's essentially a remake of Ram Aur Sham, and it's a retelling of that kind of story. But what made it interesting was that here the entire film revolved around Hema Malini, the leading lady. So it clearly establishes who is the star of the film. In fact, when Seeta Aur Geeta came, Dharmender was a bigger star, and even Sanjeev Kumar was a very well-established star in his own right. Now, in 1972, Hema Malini had already had a series of hits with Dharamji, but to get Dharmender to play a glorified supporting act in a film in the mid-1970s when he's one of the top box office stars speaks volumes. Of course, Dharamji wanted to do this film for a variety of reasons, because at that time the romance between Dharamji and Hemaji was also brewing. But having said that, and besides that, it's not like Dharmender gets the short end of the stick in this film.
तुम इसकी बात मत मानना, ये सब झूठ है।
हाँ, ये झूठ है। ये झूठ है कि तेरा नाम गीता है। ये झूठ है कि तू सड़कों पर तमाशा करने वाली एक लड़की है। ये झूठ है कि आज तेरा मेरा लगन होने वाला था।
Seeta Aur Geeta leaves no doubt in your mind that who is in the driving seat.
मुझे कल रात सपने में मिला, बड़ी प्यारी सी सूरत थी, भला सा नाम था, ला 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 ला।
For a filmmaker to take an actress and put the actress at the center of the narrative is something that Ramesh Sippy was familiar with thanks to Andaz. But in Seeta Aur Geeta, he got Hema Malini to portray a double role and gave an entire range of situations and scenarios where Hema Malini could just establish her dominance over the scene.
इंस्पेक्टर साहब, हमारी भतीजी सीता कहाँ है?
हाँ हाँ इंस्पेक्टर साहब जल्दी बताइए कहाँ है?
हाय
क्या
राम।
कह रहे हैं आप? खुद ही देख लीजिए।
There are certain facets of Hema Malini's previous films, films that released before Seeta Aur Geeta, that also seep into her acting in Seeta Aur Geeta. It's not very obvious, you may even miss it, but say a film like Lal Patthar, where she plays this very villainous kind of a character, comes into play in the role of Geeta in Seeta Aur Geeta, where the dominating nature of the character just comes across as very organic and very natural.
आज से बिना काम किए इस घर की रोटी तोड़ी तो गिन के पूरे 555 जूते मारूंगी, समझे? रामू काका जी, बाजार से भाजी तरकारी अब रंजीत लाया करो.
The third film that got Hema Malini and Ramesh Sippy together is not only the biggest hit of their careers, but probably one of the biggest hits in the history of world cinema, Sholey. The casting of Sholey gives you an idea how integral Hema Malini is to the film. Everybody knows that Danny was originally cast in the role of Gabbar Singh, and fate ordained things to happen differently, and Amjad Khan ended up making his debut as the villain of the film, and the rest is cinematic history. There were rumors of Sanjeev Kumar being interested in playing the role of Veeru because that is the leading man of the film. There were also rumors that Dharmendra was interested in playing Gabbar Singh because that's the best role in the film. But then that would ensure that Gabbar Singh and Basanti cannot be together, so Dharamji and Hema Malini would not have any scenes together. Having said all that, there were also talks that distributors were not too kicked about the idea of Amitabh Bachchan being cast as Jay, and were trying to push both GP Sippy and Ramesh Sippy to probably cast a bigger star or a more known name at that time, somebody like a Shatrughan Sinha in that role. Now, in all this drama, the only person who's constant and does not change is Hema Malini and the character of Basanti, which should give you an idea that when the film was being planned, this actor playing this role was a no-brainer.
क्या कभी तांगा नहीं देखा पहले? ये गांव खेड़ा है साहब. यहाँ मोटर गाड़ी नहीं मिलेगी कि बैठे और गर्र से चल दिए. यहाँ तो बसंती का तांगा ही चलता है. देखो, मुझे बेफिजूल बात करने की आदत तो है नहीं. चलना है तो बोलो चलना है.
On the face of it, Sholey is essentially the story of Jay and Veeru being hired by Thakur to avenge his family and to take Gabbar Singh to his logical end, which is either behind the bars or in a deep down grave. When you see Sholey, you realize that Basanti is a character that needs to be discussed a little more. For the simple reason because Basanti also becomes a bridge that connects these two outsiders, Jay and Veeru, and the villagers. It is also Basanti who kind of pushes the film to its logical end with the chase sequence and ultimately being captured by Gabbar's men and taken to his den, which pushes the film into its final act.
नहीं! बसंती इन कुत्तों के सामने मत नाचना! सांभा!
टूट जाए पायल तो क्या, पाँव हो जाए घायल तो क्या.
The success of Sholey also somewhere cemented the partnership that Hema Malini and Ramesh Sippy had. The first film Andaz was a hit. The second film Seeta Aur Geeta was a bigger blockbuster, and Sholey, need one say that it's one of the greatest successes in the history of Indian cinema. There was very little that Ramesh Sippy could have done post Sholey that would have added to his filmography, or even somebody like a Dharmendra would have managed as far as leading man roles go, because there is very little to achieve after Sholey. For Hema Malini, the trajectory of her career could not have probably continued with Ramesh Sippy because the duration between films was going to increase, and whatever Ramesh Sippy was going to do after Sholey would make it almost impossible for any single character to dominate the narrative, or even when you look at a multi-starrer like Sholey, for characters to get equal screen time or equal importance as far as the narrative goes. And this is exactly the reason why Shan, immediately after Sholey, falls flat as a film. This is one of the reasons why Shan could not live up to the expectations that writers Salim Khan and Javed Akhtar had, or even Ramesh Sippy as a filmmaker would have had. Shan was always a tough act because how do you top off Sholey? Not just in terms of success, but also in terms of mounting a production. Initially, Dharmendra and Hema Malini were cast in Shan, but at the 11th hour, they both decided to skip the film because, honestly speaking, there was very little for them to do. But if you look at the film today, and if you imagine a Dharmendra instead of Shashi Kapoor and a Hema Malini in place of Bindya Goswami, there is very little for these stars to do in the film. Shan may be a multi-starrer. Shan may have had big stars such as Shatrughan Sinha and Sunil Dutt, along with Amitabh Bachchan, Parveen Babi, and the iconic villain played by Kulbhushan Kharbanda. But on the face of it, it's essentially a film where Amitabh Bachchan's character dominates the narrative.
ये क्या करें आप भाभी? आप चाहते हैं कि हम इसे छोड़ दें? ये शाकाल है भाभी, शाकाल। ये इंसान नहीं, इंसानियत के नाम पर एक भद्दा दाग है। इसने हमारे भाई का खून किया है।
It's not as if he has more scenes. It just so happens that the way the film is framed, the way the shots are taken, or the way the action is choreographed in the film, you can't help but get a sense that it is essentially an Amitabh Bachchan film. 45 years after their last film together, Sholey, Ramesh Sippy and Hema Malini collaborated once again for a film called Shimla Mirchi that released in January 2020.
शिव हूँ, मेरा रिश्ता ऐसे घर में जुड़ रहा है।
मेरा रिश्ता भी तो जुड़ रहा है ना माँ।
Take it easy, don't get so excited.
It did not manage to recreate the past magic, but the legacy of the three films that Ramesh Sippy and Hema Malini have done together in just 4 years, beginning with Andaz in 1971, Seeta Aur Geeta 1972, and Sholey 1975, is enough to establish a legacy, a creative collaboration which is unparalleled and unmatched as far as heroines and directors go in Hindi cinema. This is Cinemaazi Studio, and I'm Gautam Chintamani. Thanks for watching.